Welcome to Trust the Badge. In this episode, I interview Mr. Jim Dudley, who's a law enforcement veteran, a lecturer at San Fransisco State University, a columnist for Police One, and the host of the Policing Matters podcast. We have an interesting conversation about a variety of topics, such as his teachings at San Fransisco State and police recruitment and retainment. Let's begin with an introduction of Mr. Dudley.
Hey there. Hi, I'm Jim Dudley, and I'm a 32-year veteran from the San Fransisco Police Department, retired a decade ago. And since then, I've been teaching criminal justice studies, my alma mater, San Fransisco State University. I host a podcast called Policing Matters. I've been the host, co-host for about the first 3 years, and I've been the solo host for the last 4 years. We've got over 500 episodes in our archives available, great speakers, and to have Jaser on pretty soon.
Thank you, sir. I really appreciate your time, and hopefully we can schedule that in the future. To start off, could you just explain to the audience as to why you joined law enforcement and why you're in law enforcement for so long?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting story. I find it really resonating with a lot of students today who maybe don't know anyone in law enforcement. I didn't come from a legacy background. I didn't know anyone in law enforcement, but in my youth, growing up in San Francisco, single mom, 6 kids, it was a struggle sometimes. And those were violent times too. So those were in the 60s and 70s. And all my interactions with law enforcement, cops in San Francisco was always really good. I always happened on, a police officer who was affable and friendly and willing to talk to me as a person and not as a kid. And I remembered that. And when I went to high school, there was a youth in the law class that I found interesting. I took it, heard more about the mechanics of policing. And then a friend of mine got me to join the Explorers in my senior year. I did that, and then I joined my county sheriff's reserve office. And I think back now to the freedom that they gave us. Me and a buddy, we were both, 18, 19-year-old cadets. They gave us a radio and a police car and a list of all the people who were on vacation that go out and check their doorknobs, make sure they're not getting burglarized. And I thought, wow, now I think, if we did that today, the liability and, happening on, burglars in the act, like what would happen today. But those were great experiences. I ended up getting my junior college degree in law enforcement. Then I got a job with San Francisco PD and never had the greatest time. Best job I ever had. So many experiences. I continued my education, got my bachelor's degree, and ultimately went for my master's degree in criminology. And in the meantime, at work, I proceeded through the ranks. I did my first 10 years in patrol. I did 4 years, almost 5 years of investigations as an inspector, and then made lieutenant. Worked lieutenant for about 5 years, made captain for, in and out about 10 years. But in the meantime, I was selected to be a commander. That's a rank the chief chooses in San Francisco. So I had patrol, investigations, a little bit of administration, but mostly in patrol and investigations. Then when I made captain and commander, I went to our special operations group, got trained to be an incident commander, incident command, emergency management, homeland security issues, reviewing all our critical infrastructure that you can imagine in San Francisco is huge. And got a lot of exposure with our SWAT teams, canines, bomb dogs, all of it. And got to go to the Senior Management Institute for Police at Harvard with PERS, and then the FBI National Academy in Quantico, Virginia. That was a residency for almost 3 months there. What a great time. I still have a dozen colleagues from that experience that I keep in touch with. And And then when I retired, I came to teach and I do consulting, and I've been to probably at least one or two conferences a year to present on various subjects. My main topic today is recruiting for law enforcement, working with a bunch of companies. In my podcast, Policing Matters, I've interviewed a lot of people on the subject. We talk a lot about officer wellness and well-being, uh, not only recruiting new officers, but retaining the ones that we have and using their experience. And I think our next step is to get a hold of some of our retirees and bring them back and have them share some of their great knowledge and experience. And we're trying to recruit a new generation, and I think it's just awful that we've lost so many decades of police knowledge and experience from retirees, especially during the COVID and George Floyd era.
Right.
Be great to bring them back and use some of the tactics that made them successful and bring them up to date with today's crew.
Could you just touch up on the subject of police recruitment and retainment? Because as we see today, that is one of the hardest things that police departments are trying to do is to retain their officers and recruit more because of how discouraged officers actually are. So could you just expand on that topic?
Yeah, so we had the huge drop off even before 2020. I don't, we kid ourselves if we just said 2020 and the pandemic was the reason why so many officers quit. We saw, a gradual reduction probably 15 years ago, started, ticking up in the decade before 2020. And then I think just the negative influence of having to enforce the pandemic rules, policing, being seen as the bad guy, getting people off beaches and churches and, meeting together for block parties and things like that, enforcing masks. We just really became a villain in the whole process. And then, of course, George Floyd. And we saw what happened after that and the backlash and the defund movement and all of that. So I think if anybody was thinking of retiring or leaving law enforcement, that was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. And I think now we're in this other phase where agencies are clamoring for people to the point of offering bonuses and perks and actually stealing candidates from each other. And I think, in the grand scheme of thing, all's fair. I think anybody looking for a job in law enforcement should get the best deal that they can. But that said, some of the smaller agencies, and I think 90% of agencies in America are small, under 50 officers. And so, it really hurts those smaller agencies who maybe can't afford to give you a $5, $10, $30,000 bonus to get hired with them. So I think we need to be more magnanimous, look at the bigger picture of law enforcement, support each other. Maybe even if we have a candidate. So here in San Francisco, if we recruit, 100 candidates and 50 make it through the initial testing, but then some start to have second thoughts or get cold feet. Maybe it's, the crime rate is too high here, or they're being asked to do things with the mentally ill and homeless they might not want to do. Then maybe we refer them to another agency and has more, lesser problems, like, cars on the sidewalk enforcement or something like that, but that we should be sharing the candidate pool. And I think, not everybody's cut out for policing and not everybody's cut out for a specific law enforcement agency. So, I tell my students now, shop around. You're in the driver's seat, pick and choose, think about your future. Do you like mountains? Do you like the ocean? Do you like lakes? Do you like snow? Do you like, the sand and the sun? So use that, but think ahead about if you get married, what are the schools like? What's the general attitude of policing from the community, all of those things, and then pay. I mean, I think everyone should have, uh, a livable wage. And, I think agencies are doing their best to come up with a living wage for their economic area. So again, I think it's up to the candidate to shop around, see what's right for them, and then always realize too that once you get on with a department, doesn't mean that you're going to do 30 years. And I think that's a complaint that I hear the most from young people. Like, I can't walk a footbeat for 30 years. Tell you, I've had such a diverse opportunity set in San Francisco. I probably worked in easily 20 different assignments throughout my career. And every time I promoted or every time I moved to a different station or assignment, whether it was doing narcotics or vice prostitution, being a school resource officer, being a field training officer, working with the community, working with the business community, walking a footbeat, riding a bicycle. Um, they all, there was a learning curve to all of them. They were all new, exciting for a time, and then you built up that experience, and you be a one size fits all cop. You could pretty much do it all. So I think, my biggest breakthrough was going into emergency management and seeing how we could really do better. For Police One, I've written a few articles. I wrote one recently on how we could better prepare for large events. And I use Kansas City as an example, and the fact that there's technology there that might help us see some of these problems before, they become a mass shooting. So we had some really great guests, and the technology is evolving so fast. I mean, we're on a uphill learning curve right now, and I just can't wait to see a lot of the technology being used in our agency, especially to fill the gap between our lessening, patrol force. But retention too. Sorry to get off topic, but retention is super key. And I know there's some in law enforcement leadership who say, no, we're going to hold the line. We're going to draw a line in the sand. They don't like it, they can leave. Well, I got news for you. They are leaving. So I think we do need to be a little bit more flexible. I think most cops are in it to do what's right, to protect and serve, to catch the bad guy. And there's still room for that in law enforcement. But sometimes we forget the victims of crime. We forget that prevention is sometimes better than the arrest. And not as sexy as an arrest. It's hard to prove prevention, but a lot of our goals, a lot of our energy should be spent on prevention.
I read your article about defunding the police and why we shouldn't. Could you explain to the audience, just to summarize your points and why you think that is?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, here on campus, believe me, I see it. I've seen we have 100 tents out on our lawn right now for people protesting, the Middle East,
Right.
and and I know that the defund movement, gathered a lot of traction with people who were sort of, not understanding the goal of policing, and you know, part of our negative media image is the police are always at a horrible incident, right? Didn't start it, but we're there in response. So whether it's a mass shooting or a kidnapping or brutality or whatever else is happening, we are responding there. Law enforcement's responding to get a hold of the situation, calm things down, take the perpetrator into custody and take them away. Well, in some cases, the person that's going in handcuffs is a son, a daughter, a husband, a wife, a child, a son or a daughter, um, and a neighbor, someone in their community. So we've got to be cognizant of that fact. And I think one of the things that we fail to do in law enforcement is to communicate to the public. And I think during 2020, uh, law enforcement tended to circle the wagons. We had probably more law enforcement leaders in the command ranks leave in 2020 than probably most years before or since. And, the real leaders stuck around. The real leaders said, "Hey, what can we do to get hold of this thing?" And talking to a lot of public information officers and police officers who've written books, or they go on the circuit to talk about communication. That's key. And instead of huddling up and circling the wagons, we should have been out there every day to talk about why you need law enforcement in your community. Again, talking prevention, that, a lot of times the efforts are not seen, but they're so needed, because otherwise, and especially now with personnel shortage, the difficulty in hiring, we've got the literal thin blue line out there, and cops are running from run to run to run, and they're not getting a chance to do that community outreach. They're not getting a chance to do the prevention. And so it's this chasing the crime circuit, oftentimes with the same recidivists, right? It's not like our community throws, their name in a hat, and every day you pick your name out and say, okay, it's my turn to do a crime. No, we probably have 2% of our community doing 90% of the crime. And so instead of chasing the crime after it's happened, we need to be able to get out in front of it. And you can't do that when you're so restricted in your staffing. So that's what the community needs to hear. You need cops. You need to fund the cops. You need to fund programs. And we don't start when they're on probation or parole. We don't stop at their first, second, or third offense. We go down into the middle schools and the high schools with school resource officers. We go into the communities with footbeat officers, with regular community meetings. We do problem solving, community cleanups, helping some of the communities that are victimized by this 2% and help them get a hold of things. And I think in those, cohesive relationships between the community and the police, not only do you have lower crime, you have a cleaner community, safe spots for people to get together, community gardens, community parks. You don't have abandoned cars on the sidewalk or refrigerators or couches dumped, on the corner. You stay out ahead of all. And I think the more, that's why I do the podcast too. I hear from a lot of listeners that aren't cops, but they say, wow, I never knew that. And you or your speaker really shed light on this thing. And I wish somebody had told us that before. And I think, again, that's our downfall in policing, that we tend to stay reserved, sometimes aloof, and we don't get out ahead of things. When there's a shooting or a use of force or some sensational incident caught on video, we should have the chief out in front of that, explaining what policy is and explaining that there's an investigation ongoing, and they could say X, but they can't say Y, Z because there's still an investigation. But you got to get out there and tell the public something. Otherwise, there's a narrative that gets propagated out there, and it may not be the right narrative, and we never fix it. I mean, there's still a lot of fallacy about Ferguson, Missouri, and, you can't go back. I mean, you've got, media and NBA and MLB and NFL players standing up, hands up, don't shoot. And even though it's been disproven, that's still in the eye. It's still archived on covers of Time magazine, and it's still in the brain. When I ask students about things like that, they believe what they first saw, and they don't see a retraction in a newspaper or a, some sort of editing to a narrative 2 or 3 months after the fact it's done. So I think leadership is so important in all aspects of policing, not only in the recruiting and the retention, but also to let the officers who work for you know that you're their conduit with the community, that they don't have to defend themselves at every turn. Their leadership is out there in the media, proactive, getting out the positive message.
And when it comes to community engagement, how effective are community police stations?
Yeah, 100% effective. In San Francisco, we're a population of 850,000. We have 10 different district police stations in addition to the main headquarters downtown. So my community, I served at 3 different stations and I held a monthly meeting with the community, put out some topics, issues that they might be interested in, asked for what they wanted to talk about, and then had that meeting from 6 to 8 p.m. every month. On top of that, I also went out to the local neighborhood community groups and went to their meetings as well. So, yeah, you've got to have that constant presence. You've got to be able to answer questions. You cannot be an occupying army that just goes in there in the morning, does all the work, and then leaves, right? You've got to maintain that presence. People need to see you as people, right? You're people in the community too. You're wearing a uniform. I often go back to Sir Robert Peel. We're coming up on, his anniversary, 1829. He put out the 9 Peelian principles, and the 3 main tenets of his 9 principles are to prevent crime, as opposed from making arrests after the fact, to build trust in the community, and the two, are symbiotic. If you build that trust, you've got a neighborhood that's going to pick up the phone and dial 911, or if they see a cop on the street, they're going to tell them about a local problem. And you can't do that unless you're there in the community. And then the third one is the judicious use of force. And again, that's got to be part of your culture. And you've got to explain if you see something on video that doesn't look quite right. Sometimes, being in a fight or stopping a fight is not pretty. And you can have the courage as a law enforcement leader to go stand up in front of that community and maybe take some heat for it, but explain this is a proper use of force, or this is the use of force that we tried to apply and the suspect made it worse, or whatever the excuse is. And if you're wrong, and you've got to take that criticism, but you've got to do it in front of a community that knows you're not going to do it and run away, that you're going to be there tomorrow and the next day and the next day. So when you have that relationship, it's hard to be mad at somebody that you're going to need, or somebody that you want it in your community to keep a lid on problems. So I tell my students this all the time. You can have a difference of opinion. Just be civil about it and let's hash it all out. And at the end of the argument or disagreement, maybe one of us has changed, or maybe we agree to disagree. But to just, slam the door on people, that's never a good thing, because again, you're in the community. But I think being in the community and seeing that presence every day and being interwoven in the community, that's essential policing.
Yeah, those are some really great points there, especially because one thing everyone needs to know is law enforcement is necessary. You can't really just put them to the side. That's not what's supposed to happen. It's not going to end up in really good result.
But let me just say this, that I think we have segments of the population that want just that, right?
Right. And it's sad.
Yeah, they see law enforcement as that sort of, bulldog on a leash that you only let off the leash when something really bad happens. But, here we've had people that are against SWAT training or response to critical incident training or use of a armored vehicle. And yet when something happens where you need all those things and you need the training, then the police are criticized. So you can't have it both ways. They want it both ways, but you can't have it both ways. When we do critical incident response training and we use the armored vehicles to get officers in hot zones where there's live fire, or to evacuate people who may be injured or shot, you're saving lives. And the people who, use those tag words in that narrative of cops being militaristic and buying tanks, there's not one law enforcement agency in America that has a tank. We have armored vehicles, and when we don't, we use pickup trucks, we use Brinks armored car trucks, we use police cars, whatever we can, under live fire conditions sometimes to get people out of harm's way. And we should have the tools to get the job done. And when we see critical incident, mass shootings, like the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, where cops were criticized for their response, when you see the Harvest Festival in Las Vegas, hundreds injured from gunfire, you need the training and you need the equipment to do the job. And otherwise, you're doing, what you can, and then you're going to suffer the criticism afterwards. So yeah, people need to understand that.
That's a great point. And as I understand, you're a lecturer at San Francisco State, correct?
Yes.
So what do you really enjoy about being a lecturer there? And what's the message that you really try to tell your students about law enforcement and how they can change law enforcement in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think a lot of my students, their only interaction with law enforcement they ever had was maybe getting a ticket or what they're watching on TV or from a movie. And I love doing Mythbusters where I say, hey, what's something that you think police do, but you're really not sure if they do it or not? And or what's your favorite police movie? And when they say things like training day or end of watch where, cops are corrupt or doing drugs or they're taking off their gun belt and beating guys up in their living room, uh, I just have to tell them, no, 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 it doesn't work that way. Sometimes I get the aha moment when I'm talking about police procedure. I do a full week on police use of force, talk about Supreme Court cases. We talk about the Fourth Amendment search and seizure, use of force being considered a Fourth Amendment issue, Second Amendment, firearms, First Amendment, freedom of speech. I mean, right now, some of my colleagues used to ask, well, why do you go so much into the Constitution? And I said, everyday policing is about the Constitution, and every day we're dealing with a First Amendment issue, a Second Amendment issue, a Fourth Amendment, Fifth, Sixth, Eighth, 14th Amendment. And so if you're a cop and you don't know about those amendments, then buy one of those little $2 penguin constitutions, throw it in your back pocket. And next time your partner's writing a police report, break it open and highlight the ones I just mentioned, because when we talk about First Amendment, freedom of speech and freedom of peaceable assembly, that's different than what we've seen with riots and breaking windows and setting cars on fire and things like that. And that is not a First Amendment right. And some of what we're seeing in America today is not First Amendment free speech. And I think when students fully understand that, they get it, right? And they understand that it's not the loudest person in the room who has the First Amendment right, or it's not that my view is more important than yours, or I'm more virtuous than you, that none of those trump the other, that everybody's allowed to the same equal protection, and law enforcement's oftentimes put in the middle of that. So I love the energy. I love the student energy. I love it when we really get engaged. I love it when, they hear something maybe from TV news or from social media, and they say, hey, we want our own community police without law enforcement. We want neighbors to wear a yellow vest and be community security safety people. And then I asked them, what about serious crime? What about rape? What about child abuse, sexual abuse, those kinds of things? Then what? What about the mentally ill guys running around naked, smashing car windows? What do you do in those situations? And then who makes up the rules? And what might be okay in some cultures may not be acceptable to everyone else. So I think sometimes, I can see the gears moving or the light bulb go on where they start to think about the downstream, down the road, unintended consequences of these ideas, and then realize they're not sustainable. or that they're not realistic. They seem like a good idea in the 1 minute elevator speech, but when the doors open and they get into reality, maybe not so much.
That's a really good explanation. And from one podcaster to another podcaster, what do you really enjoy about having your own platform to speak your views in about supporting law enforcement? What do you really enjoy about having a podcast?
Yeah, I mean, I love the emerging technology. I love hearing from cops telling war stories. That's one thing I miss. People ask me, I miss being a cop? And the thing I miss most is riding around, talking, telling stories, having a cup of coffee, hearing what the other guys are up to or gals. And then, the emerging technology and how that can help police, or the mental health or wellness programs that are helping cops. I just joined a board called the 100 Club of San Mateo County, where I live, and it's a group that is primarily a supporter of law enforcement officers' families of law enforcement officers killed in the line of duty. So not only does it help with emergency funding, but also scholarships for the kids of cops killed in line of duty, also prevention, training, maybe mental health support and things like that. So there, I think depending on where you live, you might not be hearing a lot about these programs. I love the idea that we're talking to these people. Some things are really interesting. We're putting them out there. And it's a spark for people to say, oh, you know what? I'm going to look for one of those in my neighborhood, or I'm going to look for a program that we could bring and duplicate it for my agency. Or, yeah, I can't wait to see this technology. In my show notes, I always add a link to some resource, whether it's grant or a YouTube or a website, where whatever it was we were talking about, people could go and find out more. I think that's really important too. But uh, I'm a life member for the FBI National Academy Associates and PERF. I join IACP every year. ILETA, the International Law Enforcement Educators and Trainers Association, presented last year in St. Louis for them. A lot of stuff happening, a lot of innovation. Love bringing it forward. And if anybody's on the treadmill and listening and going, oh, wow, I did not know we were doing that, then, mission accomplished. And a lot of retired cops write books, and they're writing books based on, some of the cases that they've worked on. We've had true crime writers talk about John Wayne Gacy, talked about this kidnapping that occurred here in Northern California that really was an interesting case. Misty Usu, they did a Netflix docudrama on it called American Nightmare. And yeah, she was awesome telling about her story. Bill Powers near Boston, talking about his case of an arson where they found a dead young girl inside, and linked it up to a local who was who killed himself actually shortly after the murder. So interesting people, good stuff.
For sure. And just before we end, what message do you have for law enforcement listening to this, or people who are considering to join law enforcement? What would you tell them?
Yeah, I mean, I think these podcasts are a great way to sort of, listen while you're gardening or running or walking, or, it's sort of passive entertainment. And if something clicks with you, or there's something really interesting, stop and take time to listen to it, follow up. I always put my email at the end of my podcast, policingmatters@policeone.com. And I ask listeners, let me know what you think. Let me know if there's a topic or a person you'd like to hear from. Let me know. And yeah, I think, for some small agencies, like I said, 90% are under 50. Maybe they don't have a big training budget. I know University of San Diego uses my podcast for training segments. And I know that we've had them broadcast as training segments as far away as Germany. So, yeah, I totally appreciate it. I love getting the message out there, the positive message of policing. Somebody once called me a law enforcement evangelist, and I'll take that. I don't like the idea of being an advocate to the point where we can't do anything wrong, because that's not true in any profession. But as a proponent, as someone who's looking to help recruit and retain and to make our cops better, that's my job. And like I said, best job I ever had. And, you know, I totally understand why some people walk off the job and never want to look back. But for me, it gave me so much. I feel it's my job to give back. And that's why I'm teaching today. And that's why I'm doing the podcast. And I do some consulting work as well. So if not me, and when a reporter calls and asks me about something, I'm always happy to talk, because if not me, then who? And sometimes, I'll read
Right.
something in the paper and say, that is so wrong. Right. So,
It happens. Yeah.
yeah, and it's great. It's great educating a news reporter who says, "Wow, I never knew," or that's different than what I'm hearing. So that's always gratifying as well.
Well, thank you so much for your time. And for those listening, again, Mr. Dudley's podcast is Policing Matters on Police One. I'm sure you've probably heard of it or are maybe listening to it already, but it's a great podcast. And Mr. Dudley's articles are absolutely amazing. I read them on policeone.com. So make sure to check those out as well. And Mr. Dudley, thank you so much for your time.
Hey, Chase, so good to meet you, and can't wait to get you on the Policing Matters podcast.
That sounds great. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to this episode of Trust the Badge. Please follow at Trust the Badge on Instagram for updates, and follow Trust the Badge on any podcast platform such as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube.